Good evening and welcome to tonight's presentation of A Life Worth Remembering, the Monumental Life and Legacy of Abraham Lincoln. By now, most of you know me. I'm Jamie Stout, the Director of Membership for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. Each webinar is growing and growing, and this might be the biggest one yet. We have nearly 250 people registered. I know I'm personally super excited about tonight's presentation because it's unique and it has a great visual slideshow. But none of this would be possible if it weren't for the generosity of our members. As always, we thank you for the dedication to preserving Mr. Lincoln's legacy. So let me introduce to you tonight David Wiegers, our presenter. David is a lifelong Lincoln buff and an accomplished photographer. David, who now lives in Gurnee, Illinois, grew up in Decatur, Illinois, and had an abiding interest in Abraham Lincoln ever since his parents packed him and his 5 brothers and sisters into the back of the family station wagon for the obligatory trip to visit Mr. Lincoln's hometown here in Springfield. Coupling his longtime love for photography with his near obsession to photograph the entire body of Lincoln sculptures throughout the country. He spent nearly 15 years and driven and flown thousands of miles across 30 states and photographing and researching images of Lincoln that he could find. And his 30th anniversary vacation to Hawaii in 2007 was scheduled so that he could photograph a statue near Honolulu. And I think we must get to that story for sure tonight. So as always, go ahead and type your questions below. We'll get to as many as possible. But without any further ado, please help me welcome David.
Hi, Jamie.
Thanks.
I tell you what, if everybody's ready, I'm going to get going. Jamie mentioned the trip that I took to Hawaii, and I'm gonna jump ahead a little bit and talk about a trip that I took with my wife out west. So we took what ended up to be about a 10,000 mile trip, starting at Mount Rushmore and going all the way down to Southern California, up the coast, down and back across through Spokane, Washington, and Minnesota, North and South Dakota. And as we So there we go. So we get to Mount Rushmore and we're looking for a place to stay. We've realized, oh my gosh, it's the 4th of July. We finally find a place to stay. Next day, we head to Mount Rushmore. And as we got to Mount Rushmore, we noticed there was a museum. And the museum was for Gutzon Borglum, who, as many of you might know, was the sculptor, or at least the head sculptor of Mount Rushmore. And we pulled into a parking lot of the Gutzon Borglum Museum and saw this sign. And it's basically just your standard 1950s, 40s roadside historical monument sign. And the last 2 lines struck me. And this is what they said. Every statue must tell a story. This is Borglum. It should portray a moment in our nation's history or a man's life that's worth remembering. So that really struck a chord with me. Found it very, very meaningful. So what I did, I took that home, and as I started to think about Lincoln, I realized that Lincoln's life has been pretty much told completely from his youth to his presidency in sculpture. And so we'll start from there. First of all, this photo is from Springfield, Illinois. It's the Gutzon Borglum bust of Abraham Lincoln that everybody has seen in front of the monument. This is my granddaughter's finger, her first contact with Abraham Lincoln. So she got right with Lincoln early. So in my mind, there's no figure that lived a more memorable life and left a greater legacy or had a more inspirational life story than Lincoln, really. There are more statues, monuments, and more memorials dedicated to Lincoln than any other American. At this point, I have identified and photographed well over 300 major, or what I would call, I guess, significant pieces of public and private art dedicated to Lincoln. The question may come up, and I thought I would get it out of the way. There are statues erected to honor and remember Lincoln in 41 of the 50 states, and there could be more, but as you might imagine, there's a number of states in the Old South that don't honor Lincoln with statues at this point, even though there are some in Virginia and Tennessee. Unusual. So the most common question I get is, how many are there? I haven't found all of them, but at this point I have 485 different statues or monuments or memorials that have Lincoln's image on them. And that includes foreign countries, about 22 different foreign countries. So as I've been stuck at home during the pandemic, I found even more, and now I'm anxious to get out on the road once we can travel more freely and start to photograph the rest of them. And just as a teaser, sometime within the next few months, hopefully not before the end of this year, we're gonna have a Google map up that shows the different statues, and you'll be able to plot a trip. So what we're gonna do this evening, I've got a handful of statues picked, and we're gonna talk about how these artists portrayed Lincoln and give you a little bit of history. I think that the statues are fascinating, and I hope you like the ones I picked. But the story behind some of these is just as fascinating as the statue itself. So I want to start with the surprise. Everybody that I talk to that wants to talk Lincoln statues wants to know, where was the first Lincoln statue? Was it in Washington, D.C.? Where was it? And believe it or not, it's this statue right here. This is a statue of Abraham Lincoln that was erected about a year after his death in San Francisco, California. And it wasn't sculpted by anybody particularly famous at the time. It was sculpted by an Italian immigrant, and his name was Pietro Mezzera. And in the 1865 San Francisco City Directory, he's identified as a stone cutter and a cameo maker. Later in life, he did become pretty famous. He did a lot of figural sculptures for the state capitol in California, in Sacramento. But this is a plaster statue, and it was first shown in August of 1865. So Lincoln dies, and in August, Mr. Mezzera has this statue finished. It wasn't actually unveiled officially until a year later, on April 14th, 1866. So this is how the newspapers of the day described the statue. It said, Mezzera's Lincoln stands beside the tree of liberty with his right foot firmly planted on the reptile of secession that issues from the roots. The left arm stretched out at full length with the hand grasping the scroll of Emancipation Proclamation, his right hand with open palm spread out as a protection to the Constitution, you can see with his right hand, and the emblem of the Union that rests upon the trunk of the tree of liberty. So he was telling the story of Lincoln and the Civil War and the emancipation of slaves in one statue, which a lot of sculptors in those days used a lot of symbolism and allegory in the statues. People understood that means of communication. So another paper said, headline, Statue of Mr. Lincoln. California sculptor has nearly completed a colossal statue of President Lincoln. It's 9 feet high, stands on a pedestal 10 feet in height, making a total of 19 feet. The posture is described in a San Francisco paper as majestic and commanding. The left arm extended in front, the hand grasping a scroll supposed to be the Emancipation Proclamation. Underneath the right foot rides a serpent, close by is a broken shackle of slavery, an allegorical stump of a tree from which grow 2 clasped hands indicating the Union. So there Mr. Lincoln stood in front of Lincoln School in San Francisco until 1906. I'm sorry, until 1888. This is his first mishap. So he's standing there for lo these many years with his arm stretched out, and what happens? His arm fell off. The plaster statue gave way and his arm fell off. Can't laugh. I mean, how hard is it to hold your arm out like that for 23 years? It happens. So they replaced Mr. Lincoln's plaster statue with something called French bronze, and it remained in front of Lincoln School for 18 more years. So now it's 1906. It's April 18th, 1906. The Great San Francisco earthquake rocks the city. Fires erupted immediately. The town is burnt. And 3 days later, fires are put out. They come back to Lincoln School, and this is all they find of Mr. Lincoln. He had burnt down, he melted completely, except for one small piece there you can see of the tree. So the story is, and I've never been able to confirm this, but the story goes that they saved some of that and they actually made a gavel out of it. I don't know if that's true, but nothing was saved. This plaque, as far as I know, has never been saved, and no other piece of the statue has been saved, but that is really the first Lincoln statue. So the next one we're going to talk about here is one that I think maybe many of you have seen. This bust of Lincoln is in Chicago, and it's been in the Englewood neighborhood now since, I guess it's 1926. It was dedicated on August 31st of 26, and it was dedicated and placed in front of what at one time was the Lincoln Garage back here in the background of the picture on the right. So it was a concrete bust, and Wolcott Avenue, which is one of the cross streets here, at one time was Lincoln Street, but they changed Lincoln Street to Wolcott. And nobody really knows why they changed the name, they just did. So back in those days, this neighborhood was one of the first stops for immigrants that would get off and come into this neighborhood via passenger train, and there was a station in Englewood. So the area was settled mainly by Italians and Germans and Scandinavians. Bloomquist was the name of the gentleman that paid for this statue. He was a veteran of World War I. And finally, today, the neighborhood has changed so many times, and today it's mainly an African-American part of the Chicago area. So it's really not known when the first time this was vandalized, but at some point, as you can see, somebody dislodged Mr. Lincoln's nose from his face. And then over the years, the statue would be painted, it would be dotted with polka dots like a Dalmatian. It would be tagged with different symbols. This particular symbol here, the Star of David, or the star on the side of Mr. Lincoln's face, is a gang sign for a Chicago gang called the, let's see, the street gang is the Gangster Disciples, I'm sorry. And apparently this was their turf, and they were marking out their turf. And supposedly, from what I have gotten from my research, is that the six-pointed star that they chose symbolizes the gang's principles, a principled gang: love, life, loyalty, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. So this stood here for a long time. I photographed this back, 2008. Sometime just a couple of years later, this picture or similar pictures appeared in the Chicago newspapers. Sometime during the evening of Wednesday on August the 16th of 2017, someone decided that they were going to vandalize Mr. Lincoln very seriously. So they covered him with some type of a flammable liquid, lit him on fire, and of course concrete doesn't burn, so it mainly just covered him with soot. So while the city decided what they were going to do, somebody decided to come back and finish the work. And you can see on the right, they covered him with some kind of tar paper, then doused it with a flammable, and then lit him on fire. once again, the statue wasn't damaged. It was simply discolored. But at that point, the city has picked it up, taken it back to the city garage, and it sat there for probably a year or more, maybe a year and a half. And at some point, they finally decided what they were going to do with it. So they took it, cleaned him, completely refurbished him as best they could. They did not replace the nose. They got all the soot, all the charring off of him, and they have now placed him in a garage, or not a garage, but from the garage, they took him to the local Englewood branch of the Chicago Public Library System, and they have put him into their garden in the center of the building. But since they did that, the pandemic hit, and I haven't been able to get down there to photograph Mr. Lincoln in his new home. But somebody, I'm sure you're wondering, why in the world would somebody do this to this statue? Some people speculate that since it took about a week after the confrontations between the white supremacists and the protesters in Charlottesville, that this had something to do with it. Some people then chalked this up to just some young, stupid kids looking for some publicity, kind of piggybacking on the publicity that was coming from the Charlottesville incidents. And I just kind of wonder if maybe it wasn't related to gang enmity, one gang trying to do something to the other gang. I guess we're not really going to know, but he's cleaned up now, and hopefully he's safe. But this particular statue, his story has been all over the papers over the last, well, I guess, year and a half or 2 years. But the latest is that he is safe. Now this statue here, this is one that I doubt if very many of you have ever seen. I was absolutely gobsmacked, to use an English term, when I saw this. I do a lot of my research, thank goodness, on the internet. This wasn't in anything written, printed that I could find. I stumbled across this statue on the campus of Rogers State University, which is in Claremore, Oklahoma. It's a medium-sized state university in probably northeast Oklahoma, between Springfield, Missouri, and Oklahoma City and Tulsa. This sits on the center of campus next to a large lake, and this was done by a sculptor that was on staff at Rogers State. And I'm going to give you a bunch of really close-up views of this, because it's just, I don't know how to describe it. It's just completely unusual. It's sculpted by a Korean guy, and his name was Yeon Sim Pak, P-A-K. So Mr. Pak, who actually died in 2006, was born in Korea in 1928. He came to the United States in 1981, and he got hired as a artist in resident at Rogers State University. And he sculpted this massive statue of Lincoln. But on campus as well, there's a large statue of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So Rogers State is named after Will Rogers, the famous American humorist and satirist. And there's a connection, I think, with Lincoln. He is compared to Lincoln in some ways in his breadth of empathy, his feeling for people, his humor, and his devotion to the country. Perhaps you may have heard, I don't know, this quote from Rogers. He says, "I don't make jokes. He says, I just watch the government, and then I report the facts." In another occasion, he said this: "Half our life is spent trying to find something to do with the time we have rushed through life trying to save." Interesting. So this is the back of the statue. So front and then the back. And you can see on the bottom, it's inscribed, "Dedicated in the spirit of equality and democracy." and was dedicated June 19th, 1992. So this statue is made of a really unusual material. It's not marble, it's not granite, it's not bronze. It's a special material that the sculptor helped to develop with the help of someone affiliated with the university. And it was developed and called Kell stone, Kell stone, and later became Pack stone after the sculptor. And so this stunning Lincoln was sculpted over a structure using stainless steel rods, and then he used Kell stone, and it's an exceptionally strong material. This statue has sat there since '92 with very little, if any, work done on it. It's composed of silica sand, white masonry cement, and a special, some type of a polymeric additive or resin. And then it's covered with something that they also developed called Kell glaze. So it gave it, when it was brand new, and I'm sure it would probably look that way if somebody sprayed it with a power washer, would probably look a lot like polished marble. So he was interviewed. This is Mr. Pack, and this is a close-up of his Lincoln as he was finishing it up. He was interviewed by the local paper in Claremore, and he described his artistic style as coming from heaven, from God, led by the Spirit and nature, from the eternal learning process from within, and involving carefully laid dimensions and detail, detail, detail. So this stone was the ideal medium for Pack's art. It allowed for him to really get fine detail. And you'll see in some of these pictures here in a second, the wrinkles in his face and the veins in his hands are just amazing. So let's take a look at some of the details in Mr. Pack's Lincoln. This is his side view. You can see up in the face, very, very detailed. The hair, the individual strands and clumps of hair, the veins in the back of his hand are just amazing. So as we look at this, notice all of the Civil War and slavery iconography in this piece. It's really represents Lincoln's life and the war all within this single piece. So this full-length sculpture of Lincoln stands basically amidst the detritus of war, the broken pieces of war, and at the same time he's standing in a cemetery, basically, as he was when he gave the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So he wears a Civil War era suit with a cloak. You can see it's closed at the top with a cloture. Here's the face. Look at the amazing detail he got within the skin. It's phenomenal. And this piece is so big. I said it was like 20 feet tall. It's really difficult to see how detailed this work is until you can get a telephoto lens and look at it. I find it just amazing, this piece. It needs to be more well known than it is. Here's Lincoln's hands. You can see the shackles, the broken shackles, which represent emancipation, the Bible as well. These characters are cherubs. I'm not quite sure they look very happy. They look rather sad. It's supposed to be joyous. So there's cherubs holding up the flag and the cloak. Mainly, I guess it's the flag of the United States, with the dove of peace here. And then at the base, this is where we start to get into the Civil War part of it. You can see over here on the left, some ribs, maybe from a horse, a boot. Not quite sure what this piece is, but then you can see the skull. Over on the right-hand side is a drum, all covered with this flag, and I think that may be the flag of the Confederacy, if I'm not mistaken. Here's some more. Here's the front. You can see Lincoln's boots, and here you can see a broken wagon wheel, this sword. And then on the right, there is a cross representing the unknowns. Here's more on the back. You can see a rifle, hats. Notice on the bugle, he's inscribed the Confederacy. The piece next to the boot then is the skull of that horse that we could see the backbone of earlier. And there finally is a lily face with the unknown soldiers. And you can once again just marvel at the detail in the flower, the wood behind on the cross of the unknown soldiers. So once again, this is Mr. Pack, and tell you a little bit about him. His story didn't have a particularly happy ending. He left Rogers State. He went out on his own as a sculptor, and he tried to make it as an independent artist, struggled. For many, many years, he worked on these massive sculptures similar to his work at Rogers State. And when he died, his vision really hadn't been realized. What happened was his son took over his father's home. In the yard were all these sculptures like the one below, and other in biblical figures of mainly the Old Testament and some New Testament. And so he sold these all off. Somebody finally came through and bought all of them and put them into a religious park that they were building down in Texas. And the people that owned the park sent me this. And it's very, very reminiscent of that figure of Lincoln. So I think there was perhaps a tie-in between Lincoln and Christ in some way in Mr. Pack's mind. He appeared to be a very patriotic, but as well as a very religious man. So if you're ever in Claremore, Oklahoma, make sure you go to Rogers State University and see this piece. I would like to get back. It's been a long time since I've seen it. I want to see what kind of shape it's in. This is one that I'm particularly proud of. This is in Rapid City, South Dakota. If you've ever been to Rapid City, go downtown. They have what they call the Walk of Presidents. And on the crossroads, on the corners of each cross street, they have a statue of a president of the United States, from Lincoln all the way up to Obama. And I'm not sure when one of Trump will go up. They usually wait until they have like 3 to do, and then they give each one of them to selected artists that they work with. There's 3 or 4 artists in the Rapid City area that they work with. So this particular one is by a guy named MAHER. And the reason I wanted to show you this is really a touching piece. I worked with the folks at Rapid City. They wanted me to come out and give the dedication. And they said, we're trying to find something different. What hasn't been done? And I said, well, so there's very few statues of Lincoln doing his duties as the president of the United States. At the same time, there's only a couple that really get into his role, not only as the commander-in-chief, but as a family man, as a father. So the artist said, okay, I've got some ideas. He came back, and when I went to dedicate the statue at the old theater in Rapid City, this is what I saw. So this is Lincoln with his son Tad. And this is Lincoln as I think no artist had ever portrayed him. In this one statue, as I said, it's shown as a loving and a doting father to Tad, and at the same time as the commander-in-chief of the Union Army. So as we find Lincoln, he's seated in a chair, legs crossed. He's holding in his hands, and you'll see in a second, telegrams from the front as he's reading. Sitting next to him then is Tad, and he's dressed in his soldier's uniform that had been given to him. And down below, you'll see in a second, he's playing with a toy cannon. Now, for those of you that are looking for accuracy, this is not an accurate depiction of the actual cannon that Todd had, but it represents that. So this is a young man, Lincoln's son Tad, and the cannon meant to represent the one that Tad and his brother Willie once said to have fired off the roof of the White House. So his name is Tad or Taddy, came from Tadpole, a nickname. So Lincoln's affection for his son was such that they were together much of the time, even while Lincoln attended official business in the White House. But Lincoln spent a lot of time across from the White House in the Army, the War Department, in the telegraph room. And any of you that saw the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis saw some scenes of Lincoln in the telegraph office. Well, Tad would go with him sometimes. So Tad's featured in several statues of Lincoln, never any quite like this. There's some you might have seen of Tad standing next to Lincoln, and they're looking at a book, and that's based on a famous photograph. There's also another statue that I'll show you in a second down in Richmond of Lincoln with Tad. But here's some close-ups of the face. One of the other things I really liked about this guy's Lincoln is the smile. It's that knowing smile when a father looks at his son. And you can see the admiration and the love in Tad's face, I think, as he looks up at Lincoln and look at Lincoln's hand on his shoulder. The amount of detail and care that the sculptor took with this was really pretty amazing. Once again, here's that photo of Lincoln. This is one of the very few statues of Lincoln where he's holding his glasses or has glasses on. This telegram is dated June 7th, 1864, and what it is a casualty report from Cold Harbor. So the artist did his research on this one and found a telegram, and I can't read the number of casualties, but it's very, very high. Now, here's a better picture of that hand on Tad's shoulder. And here's a picture of the toy cannon. So once again, the detail, as you look at statues, look at it overall, and then look at the detail. Look at what the sculptor's done with the hands or the face, the movement, the way the coat blows, the shoes, things like that will tell you a lot about what the artist is trying to communicate. It's very easy to see in this one, he's trying to communicate Lincoln's the love for his son and the mutual love of his son for his father. At the same time, Lincoln was trying to do maybe the toughest job that any president's ever had to do. Now, this is that statue that I mentioned in Richmond, Virginia. It's at what they called the Tredegar Iron Works. It was where the Confederacy got some of its armament. And this was a very controversial statue, not because the fact that Lincoln and Tad, it was that Lincoln was in Richmond, Virginia at all. Some of you might know the story. Lincoln went to Richmond not long after Richmond fell. He walked through the city surrounded by crowds of freed slaves, escorted through. He went to Jeff Davis's office, supposedly put his feet up on Jeff Davis's desk. So about, I think it was 2009, they dedicated the statue to Lincoln, had Tad, because Tad went with his father on this trip. And the idea is to bind up the nation's wounds. Very, very controversial statue. A lot of Lincoln statues are controversial. Maybe we'll get into that a little bit later. But while this statue is being dedicated, someone flew an airplane across trailing a banner that said "Sic Semper Tyrannis," the motto of the state of Virginia, but also the same words that John Wilkes Booth said after Lincoln was shot and he jumped to the stage from the box seat. So get back to Mr. Maher's statue. Here's Tad. You can see Lincoln's glasses. Now you can see that expression on his face. So I want to get into this particular statue. This is one that many of you probably are pretty familiar with. This isn't the statue I'm talking about. For those of you that might not know, this is what is called the 8th Circuit marker. There are approximately, originally there were approximately 20 some of these around central Illinois. And the idea was they put these up on the county line markers where Lincoln and the other lawyers that traveled the circuit would pass from one county seat to the other as they went from one courthouse to another courthouse to hear cases. So these were the defense attorneys, and also Judge Davis went with them. So the judge traveled with the lawyers, and these are up. Many of them have been restored. I've been able to work with an artist out of Ohio and the Daughters of the American Revolution, as well as Guy Fraker, who many of you know is an expert on the Eighth Circuit. So this is basically the Eighth Circuit. And this drawing here, we'll talk about it in a second, was done by a fellow that did a lot of Lincoln art named Lloyd Ostendorf. But you can see as they would move from, for example, they'd move from, here's one here, they'd move from DeWitt or Logan to DeWitt County. They would find the place, they put this marker up. So this is the beautiful marker at the top. It stands on a pedestal about 5 or 6 feet tall. And then at the bottom of each one of these markers, it shows which county they were coming from and going to. So it's easy to find these. You can research Lincoln circuit markers and it will help you locate some of those. If you're from Springfield, they're very easy to find. So this statue, as many of you may be aware, is in Taylorville, Illinois. This is Lincoln and a pig, and it's called The Last Stop. And the reason it's called The Last Stop is because this was the very last stop before the lawyers finished, and they ended back up in Springfield. So there's always a story behind these statues, some kind or another. And the most interesting part of this story is how this particular statue came to be. So this is in front of the courthouse in Taylorville. And as you can see, this was donated by Mr. and Mrs. Monty Sechrist and family. It was dedicated in 2005. So this is one of the very first ones that I actually documented. I got to know the sculptor John McClary pretty well, consider John a good friend. And I had to actually follow John from the time he finished the statue all the way from the time it was poured, put together, the color applied, and set in place in Taylorville. It was an experience that really confirmed how I wanted to do a story about Lincoln statues. So the cast of characters, you have John McClary and Monty and Lou Sechrist. So here, I'm gonna give you a little bit of background on this. So Monty came home one day and said, Lou, as I recall, he was a very well-to-do contractor in Central Illinois, based in Taylorville. He says, I want to donate $250,000 to the city to put up a statue of Lincoln. And she went out of her ever-loving mind. She actually, this is a true story because she told me this herself and he told me it was true. She actually booked him an appointment with a psychiatrist. He went in and saw the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist gave him a complete bill of health. She still didn't want the statue done. They didn't want to spend that kind of money on a statue. He felt like he owed it to the city that had been good to him and his family. So they finally had a family meeting, I guess. And they have a huge family between their children and the extended family of about 20 people. The vote was 18-2 against Monty, and he didn't back down. Eventually, the family, as it evolved, warmed to the idea until at the end they were very, very happy. So I think I told you I actually saw this process. And what you see here is Monty and John McClary, and they're basically signing off on the statue. This is what a bronze statue looks like before it's actually poured. This is a waxman-like material. And so what John is doing here is writing something on that statue base that I'll tell you a little bit later. So remember this picture. So why a pig of all things? Well, remember, he's traveling the circuit. They get to Taylorville. This is in the 1840s, 1850s. And so, like many early towns, Taylorville was plagued with pigs. Pigs were everywhere. They ran loose in the villages. And these weren't your cute little pigs. These were some really wild and ugly beasts, as they were described as large snouts, small bodies, spindly legs, rough hair, look a lot like wild boar if you've seen those. They went by different names: razorbacks, squealing devils, land sharks, and some people even call them alligators. So these aren't exactly your county fair blue ribbon pigs. So as the story is, Lincoln was holding court one day, and we'll go back to this picture here. He's holding court one day, and he's trying to try the case. He's trying to defend his client, and these pigs are making a terrible, terrible racket. He asks the judge for time, and he says, "Judge, I'd like you to issue a writ of quietus." And so the judge says, okay. They shoo the pigs away. And of course, the story could be true, may not be true. However, I found a story that in 1850, the sheriff of the county was directed to put up a fence around the courthouse to bar the local free-range pigs from getting too near the building. So apparently, Mr. Lincoln's writ of quietus worked, and he got the fence up. So this statue was started in 04. Finally, a year later, was finished. So after they had this beautiful ceremony, there was a Lincoln presenter, there were state senators, U.S. senators, different speakers, bands, children. They named the pig. The Seacrest spoke. And then after the ceremony, they went down and they pulled the covering off, and they found this in the lower right-hand corner. Monty and Lucy. John had actually carved their names into the final version of that statue. I've never seen it ever before. Very, very unusual. So that's the story of The Last Stop, and it had a very happy ending, despite the fact that Lou thought that Monty was nuts. So real quick, as I have gone through and haven't really had enough time to really give you as broad a look at these as I can. That's why I hope someday to get a book out. These are just some sculptures that I want to show you that kind of represent what I've seen Lincoln statues representing around the country. So this is the only statue that I know of. It's in Hodgenville of the Lincoln family, Thomas, his wife, Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln and his sister. These are young Abraham, very few of these. This is in Hodgenville. This was actually in Dixon, Illinois, in a school. He was a Hoosier Youth. He spent a lot of time in Indiana, but there's not as many statues. So this one is in Fort Wayne. This one here, I call the Prairie David. I think it's reminiscent of Michelangelo's David in a fashion. He was a rail splitter. So there's statues of Lincoln as a rail splitter. This one's at the U of I on a building called Lincoln Hall. This one's in Decatur, Illinois, on the campus of Millikan. He was a soldier. This is in Dixon. This is in Kent, Illinois, up near Freeport. Urbana. He's a lawyer, country lawyer. He was also a corporate lawyer. People want you to think that he was just this poor country lawyer, but he was not. He was rather well known, and not just in Illinois, but outside of Illinois. He was a family man. Very few, if any, statues other than these two of Mrs. Lincoln with Abraham. Here's his candidate. These are two statues of the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's an orator. This is in Illinois, down near Pana. This is one of my favorite statues. This is a more recent statue, very similar. This artist here in the middle swears he never saw the picture on the left. Matter of fact, he was a little indignant that I would even show him this one because he thought I was saying that he copied it. He's the Great Emancipator. This is at Gettysburg College. And this is the controversial statue in Washington, D.C. A copy of this was removed actually in Boston. President Nixon, I'm sorry. President Lincoln in D.C. Go to the Summer Cottage, you'll see Lincoln and a horse. Very few statues of Lincoln with a horse, even though he spent a lot of his life on a horse. That's because they're expensive. That's the head of state, Lincoln, Father Abraham, and finally, Lincoln as the martyred president. This is in Southern Indiana. And what's happened in the last few years, Lincoln's been taken down from the pedestal, literally. You can come up, you can be with Lincoln. And finally, probably the statue that everybody is familiar with is this piece from the Lincoln Monument. This is a picture I took in a flash, and I love this. This probably gets as much reaction as any. So as you go through here, I think you can say his life was worth remembering. And it's a story worth telling. So I went a little longer than I thought I was going to, but I kind of got into it, Jamie.
That's okay. Everyone can see your passion for your photography and the statues especially. And as I said before, there is no shortage of questions. I don't think we'll get to all of them tonight, but we'll try to get to as many as possible as quickly as we can.
If they want to reach me offline, they can. Here's my address, and I have a Facebook page too. So
perfect. Yes.
You can find me.
Expert in this type of thing. I've even sent somebody else your way just with another random question. So
okay.
Tons of questions. One of the questions that's interesting is, of the sculptors whose work you've photographed and studied, which one do you think is underappreciated?
Oh boy, that's of the ones that have done a lot of statues. There's a fellow named George Gray Bernard, and he used to be very well known. He probably did the most controversial statue ever done of Abraham Lincoln, believe it or not. It's in Cincinnati. There's a copy in Louisville, and there's one in Manchester, England. He was a wonderful sculptor, but one of the reasons I like him so much is that Robert Lincoln hated him. He hated this guy's sculpture. If you go online, look up Barnard, Cincinnati, Lincoln, and you'll see it's known as the bellyache Lincoln, because in the pose, he's holding his hands kind of at his belt level crossed. And I think he's underappreciated. He's a wonderful sculptor. A lot of these sculptors that did Lincolns maybe only did one Lincoln, but they have a huge body of work of very well-known pieces, just not necessarily of Lincoln. But I particularly like Barnard.
Nice. Yeah, that's good explanation. Catherine Harris has a question. She says,
hi, Catherine.
She's excited. She's got lots of questions. So one that we want to get addressed is the statue in London was abused after the George Floyd murder. Have you photographed that particular statue, or have you photographed other statues out of the U.S.?
Yeah, I did. I actually photographed that one. One of my favorites is in Edinburgh. By the way, the statue in London wasn't really damaged. Actually, it wasn't vandalized as much as they sprayed on the names of people who had suffered at the hands of racism. So it was vandalism, but it was maybe vandalism for the right reasons, I guess. I think I've seen, let's see, Manchester, London, Edinburgh, Paris, Vienna, San Marino, 2 or 3 others. There's a bunch of them around the world that I haven't seen. There's 3 of them in Havana, of all places. Fidel Castro, big Lincoln guy.
Well, the world does love Mr. Lincoln.
They do.
We know that for a fact. That's for sure. David asks, any idea why do you know why San Francisco was the first statue? It seems like it would be Illinois or Kentucky or Indiana or.
I don't know. It's never come out in any of the research. I even know of one that happened earlier than that, but it wasn't a full-size statue of Lincoln. Um, a lot of the statues of Lincoln that came either close to his death or before or after were done by artists like Vinnie Ream and Jones and Ames, who did busts from life. But Mr. Mezzera never saw Lincoln, but for whatever reason, you know, he was an immigrant. He loved his country. California was a relatively new state. I'm sure he was just filled with the spirit, was crushed when Lincoln died, and decided to do a statue. I don't know if there's any explanation that really will ever come out as to why he did it. I've never found anything.
Interesting. One of the questions out there from Kim Bauer, she's asking, what are maybe the top 5 cities that have Lincoln statues? So maybe we should try and get to those when it's safe to travel again.
Yeah, well, Springfield, of course, New York City, Washington, D.C., the San Francisco area and the LA area have a number. Decatur, Illinois has 4 or 5. Some of the states around us have a lot. You can see a lot of statues in a day in Michigan, especially in Wisconsin. There's a number in Indiana. There's 2 or 3 really nice statues in Indianapolis. So hopefully, once I get my Google map put together, you'll be able to look and find out where the concentration of the little flags are. We're going to have an Abraham Lincoln top hat to designate where the statues are. And you can say, okay, I want to go see statues here, and it'll help you map it.
That's awesome. That'll be a great resource.
Yeah, that's kind of exciting.
To share that with our members. Once you get that out, be sure and get that to us.
Will do.
Jenny is asking, of all the Lincoln statues and memorials that you've seen, which one do you feel best represents his unique qualities?
Wow. Wow. His unique qualities. Boy, there's so many good ones, because, you know, different parts of his life represent different parts of the man. So it's really difficult. It's easier to maybe give you my top 5, and of course the top 5 would be the Lincoln Memorial, of course, though I that's not my favorite. I like the Bernard piece because it's unusual and it shows him as a very raw-boned prairie youth. There's a statue commemorating the Freeport debate up in Taylor Park that I think is wonderful, by an artist named Crunell. I think he's really underappreciated. He's the guy that also did the Lincoln Soldier in Dixon. I really like that one. There's so many. It's really impossible. It really is. But one of the pieces that I like probably as much as the Lincoln Memorial that Daniel Chester French did is in Lincoln, Nebraska, and it stands in front of the state capitol, and it's Lincoln just before he gives the Gettysburg Address. His head is bowed, his hands are in front of him, he's just stepped forward, and behind him on this huge granite wall are inscribed the words of the Gettysburg Address. And that was done, oh gosh, a decade and a half before he actually did the piece in the Lincoln Memorial. I really like that piece a lot.
Very good. We'll have one last question, and that's from our friend Bob Willard. He asks a question from near Los Angeles. He says, in parentheses, which might have the most sexist statue of Lincoln at the Federal Building. Have you created a numbering system for statues as Laurent or Ostendorf or others did for Lincoln photos?
You know, I have not, and that's a great idea, Bob, and we need to talk about that too. I do have my database. I've got it broken out by state, by city, by sculptor, and then by type, whether it's president or Youth or a bust or large, what they call heroic size, a large full-size statue of Lincoln or any figure in larger is called heroic sized. But I don't have a numbering system like they have for Lincoln photographs. Probably would be a good idea, and maybe Bob could help me work on that. I really appreciate that question. That's a good idea. I'm going to write that down.
He's your man to get a hold of, that's for sure. So
yes,
there's so many people that have so much passion and knowledge in our audience and our members. So we certainly encourage you to reach out to David. His information's there, and follow his Facebook page too. He is always very active in there and showing different images. You can clearly tell it is your passion. And I just want to thank you again so much for taking the time to put this together for us tonight. I think we understand that this is just a small piece of your collection, but it is something that helps us to understand statues a little bit more and take a little bit different look at them in depth the next time we see them. So I appreciate that part of it very much.
Thank you.
And David is giving us a unique opportunity tonight for those of you in the audience. You have a chance at winning a free 2021 calendar that he personally makes these each year of his favorite images. So after tonight's presentation, I'll randomly draw from someone who's attended, and he'll drop that in the mail to you. And as always, tonight's presentation is recorded. We'll share it with you on our Facebook group and our YouTube pages within the next 24 hours or so. We encourage you to share this with others in your life and encourage them to become a member of the foundation so that they also can receive these same benefits. Like I've said before, the more we share history, the more we create the next generation of future historians just like you guys. So we really appreciate it. We have several webinars coming up into February. February is a unique month because we actually have 3. February 3rd, we're going to be interviewing Aaron Carlson Mast, our new president and CEO of the foundation. We'll also have Justin Blandford of the Old State Capitol and author Thavolia Glimpse on her recent book. So February is going to be hopping, but hey, it's the birthday month, so it's a special month for all of us. And as we close out the webinar tonight, we do ask that you take a short survey. It helps us to improve these. It helps us to know what type of events you want in the future. And that's how we've been able to bring many of these coming up forward for us, for you. So we again, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. If, like always, if you feel so moved, you'd like to make a contribution, we ask you to go to www.alplm.org and make any amount of donation to make these things continue and possible. Again, thank you, David. Thank you, everyone out there who joined us, and we wish you well, and we will see you all in February. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Jamie.